Good day. We are Group 8 and we will be discussing the remaining chapters of Renato Constantino's The Continuing Past. Setting the scene for this chapter, World War II just finished and Manuel Rojas and his Liberal Party in the 1946 elections was victorious. However, pre-war conditions couldn't be simply restored because of the profound changes that the war brought to our country and the whole world. The economy was shattered. There was also a large arms sector in our country, which was regarded by the status quo as a threat to smooth restoration. Finally, and most importantly, the United States gained global economic power post-war. With this power, they gained control of many areas, including the Philippines. American policies that were applied in our country reflected the concerns picked up from the Great Depression of 1929. For economic recovery, business leaders wanted the U.S. to unite the capitalist nations and be their leader. This led the efforts of the U.S. post-depression and post-war to move towards bringing down trade barriers that were previously erected by rival capitalist countries. To do this, the Marshall Plan was developed. Although the plan was seen as a magnanimous effort of the United States to aid sister countries in post-war recovery, it was actually just a massive transfer of Americans' tax money to U.S. corporations through the aid of European countries. This idea, however, only aims to leverage on the benefits working from developed nations. Instead of only targeting developed countries, the Americans also sought to expand their control in developing nations. This is called the two-pronged strategy. In the context of the Philippines after a war, a new transformation was also being mobilized, from a colony to a neo-colony. This meant the continued domination of the economy, its retention as a market for American goods, a source of raw materials, and an open field for American investments. To add to this, the Philippines would also serve as a jumping point for military operations for Americans if need be. So what did then President Ross do about this? Well, Ross assumed office at a time when the chances of starting the country afresh was actually favorable. The pre-war economy was based on lopsided trading, it was in shambles, and there was a fairly strong coalition of liberals demanding an end to colonial relationships. However, he did not believe in the capacity of the Philippines to survive and rehabilitate its economy without American aid and investment. So, he sought urgent assistance as soon as he was elected. Ross believes that the funding of private corporations with U.S. grants or loans could fix the economic problems of the Philippines by increasing production and thus providing people with jobs and lowering prices. While Americans were setting the foundation for turning the Philippines into a neo-colony, Ross used up all the resources and control he had at his disposal to help push these policies. The Belt Trade Act, the Tidings Rehabilitation Act, the Military Bases Agreement, and Military Assistance Agreement. Let's talk more about how these exploitive policies crippled development in our country and greatly benefited the U.S. The Belt Trade Act basic objective was the continuation of free trade between the U.S. and the Philippines. It put our country under 28 more years of the old colonial pattern, that is the PH, importing American goods and exporting raw natural products. The Philippine peso was also pegged to the US dollar at 2 pesos to $1, preventing the Philippines from using its currency policy for purposes such as protecting home industries and stopping excessive importation. The equal rights parity is the most oppressively burdensome provision in the amendment, which obliged the Philippines to grant U.S. citizens and corporations the same rights as Filipinos in the exploitation of the Philippines' natural resources. The Philippine Rehabilitation Act gave a total of $620 million worth of aid to the Philippines. These were then tied with the Belt Trade Act to ensure that President Ross would do everything in his power to convince the Congress and Filipino people to accept parity along with the other oppressive provisions of the act. If we recall President Ross' economic recovery plan of funding private Philippine companies, we can see how important this grant was for him. The military bases agreement allowed free use of 23 base sites for 99 years. A provision of the military bases agreement gave American military exclusive jurisdiction over all offenses or crimes committed by an American personnel. And what this means is that an American soldier could abuse or even just shoot a Filipino without getting tried by the Philippine courts. And in fact, this happened several times. The Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group, or JUSMAG, after securing U.S. bases in the country, a military assistance pact was signed under which the United States furnished military equipment, trained military personnel, and set up an advisory group for the defense structures of the country. And after all these changes, Filipinos did not just blindly accept these provisions in the country. Politically and ideologically, there were forces of protest present, such as the Hukbalhaps or the Hooks, and the Pambansang Katipunan ng Mambubukid or the PKM. Both started due to the issues of landlordism and imperialism since the Japanese occupation. Although several negotiations were attempted between the government and these protest groups, no agreement was reached, and the clashing of the two never ceased. After deadlocks in the negotiations and the kidnapping and killing of two former Hawk commanders and the Hawk negotiator, Central Luzon became a battle zone as the government declared war on the Hawks. Civilian population bore the brunt of these hostilities. Plenty of barrios were burnt to the ground and destroyed. Suspected Hawks were shot down, some were detained without charge, many were tortured, and some just disappeared. Civilian victims eventually joined the Hawks because of the excessive oppression committed. Eventually, the Hukbalhap then changed their name to Hukbong Mapagpalaya ng Bayan, or MHB. During this time, armed struggle became more attractive to the Filipinos due to the prevalence of graft and corruption and the fraudulent elections of 1949. Filipinos felt that it was futile to rely on the electoral process, so they had to take it upon themselves to create change. Protest groups not only tried to push for change through armed struggle, but also through parliamentary struggle. The Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas or PKP was in Congress, elections, labor unions, mass demonstrations, and elsewhere, fighting for the rights of the common Filipino and the non-elite. However, the PKP seriously underestimated the level of US intervention. Economic, political, and military steps were taken to ensure that the communist threat be dealt with. This is where Ramon Magsaysay comes into play with a massive propaganda machine and as the CIA figurehead. In this chapter, we'll be delving more into the progression of Ramon Magsaysay's role in relation to the development of the country and the influence of the Americans throughout this period. The Japanese Ryukyu Islands in the Philippines were the first line of defense for the US against communism. But because of the growing strength of HMB, the Philippines was viewed to be the weakest link among the chain of Southeast Asian countries controlled by the US. However, they still had to protect the Philippines because the overtake of communism in the country would mean that US investments plummet and that they would lose a strategic foothold for long-term economic and military interests in Asia. So how did the US intervene? They did this through the Bell Mission, the Melby Mission, JUSMAG, and the CIA. The Bell Mission was an economic assessment aimed to understand why the economy of the Philippines was deteriorating. Its findings are inefficient production, low incomes, excessive volumes of importation, misdirected investments, mounting deficits, and inefficiency and corruption in the government. These failures were blamed on the Philippine government, but ironically, these were all caused by the neo-colonial policies that were set up by the US. For example, misdirected investments were caused by grants that were improperly allocated, and corruption in the government is due primarily to the policies made by the US. They themselves were made aware of the fact that our economy was stunted because of their own doing. After finding out the factors that were hindering economic growth in the country, the Bell Mission came up with recommendations to solve the problem. These are reforms in public administration, improvement of production, higher taxes, more efficient collection of government revenues, minimum wage law, tax on the sale of foreign exchange, land reform, and a $250 million US grant that would be used to implement the mission's suggested programs. Let's focus more on this last recommendation. As mentioned before, the Americans made use of policies that were exploitative in nature. This grant, similar to the scheme of the Marshall Plan, is one of those tactics used to intervene in our country's internal affairs. The conditions: number 1, full control over project choices and allocation of funds. Number 2, how Philippine peso was spent. And lastly, presence of overseers for all key departments. However, the projects were not used to solve fundamental problems in the Philippines. Majority of the funds were used to build roads in Central Luzon, where protest groups are concentrated, for army operations to reach previously inaccessible areas. Mentioned in the previous chapter as one of the pillars to the US building the Philippines into a neo-colony, JUSMAG was assigned to ensure that the follow-through of the Melby Mission's recommendations. It shifted the orientation of military focus from external to internal threat by persuading the Philippine government to maximize funding to the army. Next, the CIA needed to find a new leader to replace Quirino, ideally a leader who will present American ideas dressed in Asian clothes coming from an Asian mouth, and also a leader who could recapture the people's confidence but who would be willing to accept direction and is of undoubted loyalty to the US. They found this to be Ramon Magsaysay. So let's focus on the rapid rise of power of then President Ramon Magsaysay. He went from being a bus line branch manager to a congressman to defense secretary and finally reaching the pinnacle, being the president of the Philippines. Any rapid rise to power such as then President Magsaysay should be something we should be wary about. It would be improbable that any single man could do this alone in the time span so quick that he did it. So we have to ask, what are the mechanisms working behind the scenes supporting this? And what are the motives of such support? As soon as Magsaysay came to power, he made use of the propaganda machine with the US. First, we have the Economic Development Corps, or the EDCOR, which is practically useless but very effective as a propagandistic tool. It aimed to resettle hooks that surrendered to public lands, but in the end, it only really helped Magsaysay improve its image. Next is the 10 centavo telegram, wherein anyone could send a telegram about hook-related concerns to Magsaysay. Then we have the Wells in Every Barrio projects, which was made to provide access to water for provinces, although it was discontinued after a while, and not a lot of provinces benefited from it. And Magsaysay, using the media and the press, portrayed himself as a savior and using much exposure. He would even stage scripted exhibitions of temper, usually berating his subordinates for minor mistakes and even firing some of them on the spot. This gave the impression to the people that he does not allow even the smallest of errors or infraction to rules under his watch. Then we have the National Movement for Free Elections, or NAMFREL. Teaming up with the Commission on Elections, this gave the illusion that the elections was going to be fair and transparent. Ironically, NAMFREL was actually run and funded by the CIA. Magsaysay was portrayed as the modern Hercules by the Philippine Free Press in life. He's a savior and the answer to all the problems of the country and was the bringer of change. But much like the politicians of our time today, Magsaysay was a political butterfly. He was so close to Quirino that he swore he would defend him even with his life. While Quirino grew a liking to Magsaysay, the latter was also associating himself with the opposing Nacionalista Party. In the final analysis, Magsaysay's presidency was full of empty promises. He made promises to the rural population of solving their problems, negligible change was made. Although many community development projects were created, none of them made lasting changes because of the whole system that was dysfunctional. To add to this, a greater overarching issue was that Magsaysay did nothing about the neo-colonial structure put in place. As shown in many times throughout this chapter, it is evident that he prioritized the interests and endeavors of the United States over everything else. As he rose to power, with the help of the United States, he in turn gave them a stronger hold and a deeper reach into our country.
Moving on, let us enter Chapter 10, The Nationalist Crusade. In this chapter, McCarthyism was introduced, where any opposition to imperialism or neo-colonialism is immediately labeled as communism. Sounds familiar, right? Well, this practice was conveniently employed by Ferdinand Marcos during his presidency and by Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's subordinates. Moreover, it was said that those who use this tactic are puppets of US imperialism. Now, because of the success of the CIA in putting Magsaysay in the office as president, the US would use the Philippines more as a tool for carrying out US policy in Southeast Asia. When Magsaysay was elected as president, domestic economic forces were already growing assertive. With this, some Filipinos already have the concept of protectionism, which is referred to as the practice of taxing imports to protect a nation's domestic industries from foreign competition. Filipino entrepreneurs saw this as a way to liberate themselves from the control of foreign business. Now comes Clara M. Recto. Recto became a starting point for the people's prolonged history of struggle for freedom. He was hoping for the development of a decolonized Filipino and was inconsistently joined by Jose P. Laurel. Recto became the main articulator of nationalist dissent. He saw the administration of President Magsaysay's foreign policy as an extension of U.S. foreign policy and its danger to Philippine security. In 1949, Recto criticized the Philippines' dependence to U.S. According to him, Filipinos could not rely on the U.S. to defend the country. The American bases in the Philippines would only be a magnet of aggression instead of acting as protection. Recto's first target was the Philippine foreign policy, which he labeled as mendicant, meaning relying exclusively on alms from foreign countries to survive. With this, Recto wanted the Philippines to have a separate foreign policy. According to him, the mendicant foreign policy is not enough. We must have economic nationalism where the Philippines is independent from the US. He also added that the American policy is merely for the benefit of America. What is considered beneficial for America is not necessarily good for the Philippines. Recto pushed for prudent neutrality if the US was unable to make formal guarantees that it would automatically defend the country in times of war. Personally, I greatly agree with Recto. The Philippines must not go out of her way to fulfill its colonizers' interests. Foreign nations were already enjoying so many privileges by manipulating Filipinos, and therefore do not deserve any more special treatment. Moreover, Recto was not demanding for something more than the minimum requirements of sovereignty. In fact, he was not against the Philippine-American military alliance, given that it is in a form of mutual commitment. Because the habit of obeying the US unquestioningly was deeply rooted in people, Recto's advocacies were regarded as an attempt to destroy the system, which earned him labels such as defeatist and appeaser. However, Carlos P. Romulo asserted that an independent foreign policy was not feasible, for even the mighty US had abandoned her right to one. He also stated that if the Philippines was to insist on independence, we might lose the only friend ally we have, which is the US. Despite Romulo's arguments, Recto continued his advocacies. Recto also analyzed the Filipinos' colonial complex. According to him, this was due to the Philippines' economic dependence on US. For Filipinos, America had become the alpha and the omega of human progress and political wisdom, which is why Filipino officials demonstrate excessive pro-Americanism. They also tend to have an obsession with American opinion, as if American interests were the only standards to be followed in the management of our own affairs. Though Recto had a deep commitment to Philippine nationalism, he still had an active participation in Magsaysay's road to presidency. However, this alliance with Magsaysay was short-lived. The Recto-Magsaysay battle started within a month after Magsaysay assumed office. The subject of the said controversy was the speech delivered by Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs Leon Maria Guerrero, who advocated Asia for the Asians. In this advocacy, Asia belongs to the Asians in the same way that the Philippines belongs to the Filipinos. Because Recto's interests aligned with this, he immediately supported Guerrero. Clearly, Guerrero had not informed President Magsaysay about this, for the ideas he expressed opposed Magsaysay's own views. Moreover, Vice President and Secretary of Foreign Affairs Carlos P. Garcia supported Guerrero while Magsaysay remained silent. When the American embassy asked for clarification regarding the issue, Magsaysay discussed increased American aid and delivered a speech at Clark Field, declaring that the nation's needs should not be limited by a mere slogan, which the communists use as evidence of Filipino bitterness toward Americans. With this, Magsaysay made Guerrero draft a compromise statement which disowned the anti-colonial essence of Asia for Asians. Before it was released, it was previewed and approved by Minister William Lacey of the US Embassy. After the battle, Recto began a thorough exposition of the nationalist concept after recognizing the risk of letting Magsaysay commit the Philippines more and more to American policies. This took form in the active participation and discussions of the foreign policy questions of that period. However, after several attempts, Recto became more convinced that he could not remove Magsaysay from his attachment to Americans. With this, Recto moved toward confrontation with Magsaysay as he exposed the latter's dangerous puppetry. Furthermore, Recto emphasized the significance of the rule of comity, which states that American laws can operate in the Philippines only upon the consent of the Philippine government. He strongly opposed the American government's claim of ownership rights to the military and naval bases it had occupied before July 4, 1946 in the country. Recto also clashed with Magsaysay in numerous issues such as Indochina, the sending of Filipino soldiers abroad, and the question of Formosa. In these issues, Magsaysay wanted to commit the country to various international obligations to fulfill the Americans' interests. However, Recto opposed this as Philippine participation in such situations would be intervention. Personally agreeing with Recto, I believe that the Philippines should not make the Americas enemies her enemies too. Doing so would only risk the country's safety. Now Recto was up for re-election. However, since Magsaysay was at the height of his power, Recto knew that going against him would not be a bright idea. Again, Recto opposed Magsaysay over the latter's proposed foreign investments bill. According to Recto, it is another American scheme to hinder the economic development of the country. He disagreed that the country could not industrialize without foreign investment. The Recto-Magsaysay dispute reached its breaking point when Recto resurrected a 1953 Time magazine disclosure that Magsaysay had received $250,000 from the Americans for his campaign fund. Because of this, Magsaysay challenged Recto to run against him in 1957 to end their controversy once and for all. During the 1955 campaign, Recto was branded as a communist and anti-Catholic by members of the Catholic hierarchy and its many organizations. This campaign of the church against Recto was due to its desire to elect its own candidate, Francisco Rodrigo. The church's displeasure with Recto increased during the controversy over the Rizal Bill. Recto was the original author of the proposal to make Rizal's No Limitang Hire and El Filibusterismo a compulsory reading in all universities and colleges, and was sponsored by Senator Laurel. However, the Catholic hierarchy opposed this. According to them, this bill would violate freedom of conscience and religion. Father Jesus Cavana also added that it would be harmful to read the novels since they present a false picture of conditions in the country at that time. The Catholic hierarchy even issued a pastoral letter detailing its objections and enjoining Catholics to oppose the bill. Now that I have studied and understood Rizal's No Limitang Hire and El Filibusterismo, I am really glad that Recto pushed through with his proposal. It is indeed essential for students to fuel their nationalism at a young age. Moving on December 15, 1956, Recto announced that he was running for president. However, Magsaysay died in a plane crash in Cebu on March 17, 1957, which led to Recto having new opponents. His new opponents were as follows: Carlos P. Garcia, Jose Yulo, and Manuel Manahan. Though Recto had no organization and very little money, he persisted in his campaign. However, Magsaysay's death reduced the urgency of Recto's message of nationalism since he lost the one target who symbolized pro-Americanism. Moreover, the CIA supported the liberal team of Jose Yulo and Diosdado Macapagal. For the CIA, the election results were a mixture of failure and success. Garcia, whom it opposed, won the presidency, while Macapagal, whom it supported, won the vice presidency. Unfortunately for Recto, he came in fourth after Yulo and Manahan. Furthermore, Garcia's victory was considered the triumph of machine politics. Before proceeding to the last chapter, one of the major takeaways I had was about Magsaysay. Back then, the words I always heard that were associated with him were greatness, clean, and uncorrupt. Some even go to the extent of calling him the best president ever. These people tend to overlook the pro-Americanism of the former president to the point of attending to America's interests at the expense of its own country's protection and treating oppositors of imperialism as enemies. Though it is not bad to point out Magsaysay's good side, I hope more people get to know the other side of him and reevaluate their opinions. Now, let us discuss Chapter 11, The Continuing Past. Recall that Magsaysay died in a plane crash and Carlos P. Garcia was appointed as president. According to Recto, if he did not win, he would have preferred Garcia over the other candidates anyway because Garcia was not a candidate of the Americans nor of the church, and because Recto believed that Garcia had a certain amount of nationalist conviction. Though Recto and Garcia were opponents and disagree on some issues, they still support the valid points of the other. For example, Garcia himself recognized the importance of Recto's call for economic independence and nationalism. Recto felt like he stood a good chance of influencing the new administration to adopt a nationalist orientation. In early 1958, a private meeting was arranged between Recto and Congressman Bartolome Cabangbang a member of Garcia's inner circle. This meeting marked the beginning of Recto's collaboration with the president. Moreover, Recto also approved numerous policies of the Garcia administration, such as the move to establish a multiple foreign exchange reserve, its decision to not involve itself in the quarrels of other nations, and of course, the Filipino First policy. He thought that for the first time, an administration attempted to resist foreign control over our affairs. But what really is the Filipino First policy? Well, Garcia's Filipino First policy took effect on August 28, 1958, whose main objective is to give preferential treatment to Filipinos. Initially, this policy was a very limited expression of nationalism since its purpose was merely to benefit some Filipino businessmen who wanted a larger share of foreign exchange. However, suppressed feelings of nationalism began to surface and demands for extension of the policy to other fields were made. It focused on import substitution and national industrialization, where manufacturing industries are owned and managed by Filipinos. It also aimed to stir up the Philippines' manufacturing capacity and create demand for the locally produced commodities and products. Unsurprisingly, this provoked anguished protests from foreign business quarters, specifically American and Chinese. The policy was said to be not inspired by an honest nationalism or patriotism, but of greed. Since re-elections in 1961 was nearing and President Garcia was planning to run for presidency again, he was forced to abandon his policy. Since the CIA was still in charge and they were in disapproval with Garcia's Filipino First policy, retaining the policy would be self-sabotage for Garcia. Now, Garcia was strengthening his electoral machines for re-election, while Macapagal was hoping for CIA support for his campaign. According to CIA Joseph B. Smith, it was ironic that Macapagal should want CIA support since he strongly objected to American intervention in favor of Magsaysay in 1953, repeatedly quoting from Section 56 of RA 180, which says that no foreigner shall aid any candidate, directly or indirectly, or take part in or influence in any manner any election. Furthermore, Garcia's opponents, the Liberal Party and the Great Alliance, opposed Filipino First and emphasized the corruption of Garcia's administration. With this, Garcia garnered insufficient votes to win. The election results showed that Garcia's nationalistic stance was not sufficient. Too many voters had preferred to vote against the corruption in his administration. It can also be considered that one of the factors of Garcia's defeat was the disapproval of foreign businessmen and the American government with his policy. In fact, if re-elected, Garcia opted to have a stronger nationalist stand. In addition, Garcia already predicted in 1959 that Macapagal would have CIA support since Macapagal promised to restore free enterprise and to open wide the doors to foreign investment. Therefore, in 1961, Diosdado Macapagal was elected as president along with Emmanuel Palaez as vice president. Macapagal's governance was the reverse of the Filipino First policy. Firstly, he lifted exchange controls, meaning licenses were no longer required for imports. This would be dangerous for the Philippine economy as there would be more use of foreign materials rather than local ones. Macapagal also implemented privatization where the government cannot interfere with marketing forces, which could cause a major problem. People need basic utilities and commodities to live. If everything is privatized, including basic needs, the country will be driven to poverty. Since the main goal of private corporations and organizations is profit, product prices will surely increase continuously. It was also in the time of Macapagal when the devaluation of peso versus US dollars took place. This increased the advantage of foreign enterprises by making it cheaper for them to do business in the Philippines since their dollars would now be able to buy more. Other programs implemented by Macapagal were the land reform, presence of global corporations, and entertainment of development aids. The effects of these programs were disastrous to the Philippine economy. It made the country foreign-dominated once again, made it drown in debts, and put an end to the protection of Filipino enterprises. Also, it was worth noting that Macapagal moved the celebration of Philippine independence from July 4 to June 12. Before this discussion ends, I would like to share with you a statement from Renato Constantino that sums up the most important realization that we had while working on this video. According to him, nationalism has to have an updated expression. Real independence and real nationalism cannot be attained without the involvement of masses of people. It must be expressed as unity against imperialism and not merely by saying, mabuhay ang Pilipinas. As long as we are a neo-colony and there is an imperialist country dictating the economic activities of the Philippines, we won't be able to solve our own problems without the intervention of other countries. We can only say that our nation, specifically our economy, is therefore progressing if it creates wealth and opportunities for its own people. But until then, we must not stop hoping and aiming for the best status of our nation. Thank you for tuning in.